During the interval of a recent performance of My Father's Coat in London, my wife popped backstage to see how I was feeling. She also mentioned that she was sitting next to a member of the British House of Lords and that he had invited us on a tour of the Houses of Parliament the following morning. Approaching those famous buildings from the west, one passes an open plain called Parliament Square. It is scattered with statues, generously spaced, 12 in total. Famous statesmen for the most part, Churchill and Disraeli, Palmerston and Peel. But 4 of those statues are of statesmen not born in the British Isles, yet whose actions had captured the imagination of the British establishment sufficiently to celebrate their legacy at this most central junction. And it is these 4 men, 3 of whom have strong South African links, whom I have woven into this week's Friday story. My wife and I arrived at Pier's entrance at 11 a.m. It was to be one of those life experiences never forgotten. We are most grateful to our host, whose generosity in both time and enthusiasm brought its famous corridors to life. The fate of so many key moments of modern history were discussed and often determined right here. From Cromwell through Wilberforce on slavery, the D'Oliveira affair, and this day happened to be another historic one, Brexit. One of the chambers we explored was the Royal Gallery, an ornate hall used to host foreign dignitaries. It is dominated by 2 enormous paintings by Daniel Maclise, mirroring one another down the length of the hall, Trafalgar and Waterloo. Those 2 famous British victories of the Napoleonic War, which had heralded Britain's global dominance through the 19th century. Although he did mention that those 2 paintings are carefully curtained up whenever a French delegation is received. But while those 2 battles have long captured people's imagination, the British military was, in a sense, just the armour around a more important engine. For with Britain's borders secured by its mighty Royal Navy, it was the metal foundries of Birmingham and the cotton mills of Lancashire which saw them quite literally steam ahead as the world's dominant power. This was the Industrial Revolution. And cotton is where this story starts. A fibre which for thousands of years had been woven into a soft, washable fabric offering unrivaled comfort. However, difficulties in extracting the fibre from the seed and then the intricate nature of cotton meant that it was hugely labour-intensive to convert into a usable fabric. As a result, cotton clothing remained beyond the reach of all but the tiniest fraction of society. But change was coming. Technology. The spinning process was becoming mechanized and then powered by steam, while Eli Whitney's new cotton gin, said to be inspired by a cat grasping a fistful of feathers from an unfortunate chicken, had dramatically improved the efficiency of separating cotton fibre from its seeds. And the combined impact of these 3 developments saw a dramatic decrease in the man-hours and resultant cost of processing raw cotton into fabric. Cotton clothing was suddenly to be accessible to much of society, and with a whole world waiting to be clothed, the spike in demand was immense. But notwithstanding the improved technology, cotton still remained prone to snapping. It was found, however, that a damp climate helped. Lancashire was to be perfect, both in terms of its conditions in what was about to explode into the major city of Manchester, but also for its close proximity to the port of Liverpool, into which the cotton could be shipped and where the great cotton market inevitably sprouted. The question then was, who could supply this new demand for cotton? Well, it just so happened that cotton grew like weed in the Mississippi Valley, America's so-called Deep South. But that was only half the problem solved. Because while its processing had been mechanized, the farming, picking, and separating of cotton remained extremely labor-intensive. And the United States, this land of unparalleled opportunity for so many, just didn't have people prepared to do that kind of back-breaking work for low pay. Labor shortages were not a new problem in the colonies, a challenge traditionally overcome by developing separate, legally ring-fenced classes of labor, which allowed for tight control. In the United States, indentured servitude had initially been the most common of these arrangements, but from 1663, colonists brought into Carolina from the sugar plantations of Barbados brought with them both slaves and an aggressive slave-owning way of life. Although slavery had initially only been moderately successful, and while it had spread throughout the South by the time of the American Revolution, many then believed that it was destined to die a natural death, as it had in Europe. After all, Jefferson's opening line of the Declaration of Independence indicated a self-evidence that all men are created equal. And this belief looked on track. The price of slaves halved in the 25 years following the Revolution, and the importing of slaves was banned from 1807. But then, a sudden turnaround. News of a new, almost insatiable demand for cotton, which was to transform the American Deep South. The Mississippi River, with its distinctive steamboats, now burst into life as the essential water highway of the United States, while its bustling port at New Orleans was soon rivaling New York in importance. And this cotton economy was naturally accompanied by a massive demand for slaves, a demand which initiated an extraordinary forced migration, as slaves were sold from the old South Carolina and Virginia down south into the Mississippi Valley, the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and the like. And here, slave life on the cotton plantations was even more excruciating. Interestingly, this is the reason why the seemingly innocuous phrase, sold down the river, is still equated with the emotive concept of betrayal. The difference between good and evil is opportunity, observed Anthony Thomas. And accompanying this fresh upsurge in slavery was its increasingly vigorous justification. Broad Christian principles were now exchanged for specific references, often conveniently twisted, so that by the mid-19th century an enormous cultural chasm had formed between the slave-owning states to the south and the industrializing states to the north. And this chasm eventually gave way, as the southern states broke away illegally from the Union in order to protect their so-called peculiar institution of slavery. Many Southerners believed that they would receive protection from Britain, considering just how integral cotton was to the British economy, the old saying, "Cotton is king." Indeed, by 1860, the eve of America's Civil War, cotton was Britain's biggest industry. 10% of all British capital was invested in the fibre, and more than 1 in 5 Britons made their livelihood from it. Accordingly, Britain, despite their disapproval of slavery, did have mixed feelings about the American Civil War. Many of its aristocracy felt an affiliation to southern gentry, while the livelihoods of many middle and working class people were, of course, dependent on cotton. In the end, Britain remained neutral. Instead, it was to be a tall, awkward-looking man who assumed the leading role in forcing the slave states back into the Union, and simultaneously ending the so-called peculiar institution. This was Abraham Lincoln, a man whose intellect, honor, and statesmanship had helped to salvage the integrity of the United States. Although in a cruel turn of fate, Lincoln was assassinated just 5 days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender, shot by John Wilkes Booth. But by then he was so universally revered that his legacy would be celebrated as the first foreign statue to be erected in London's Parliament Square. And while the Civil War had of course decimated the United States, it had also had a devastating impact on the people of Lancashire. Britain's neutrality implied respecting Lincoln's shipping blockade, designed to cut off southern cotton revenue from Liverpool. As a result, Liverpool and Manchester were brought to their knees. This was the so-called cotton famine, felt so acutely by Lancashire's working-class people. Indeed, commodities, as the oil companies have again recently experienced, are inherently at the mercy of events often well beyond their control. Cotton would always be a turbulent industry. And it was the grandchildren of this Civil War generation who 70 years later would again famously be compromised by an external force. This time it came in the form of a cotton boycott from India in 1929. It was being led by a small, bespectacled man dressed in simple hand-woven cloth. His name was Mohandas Gandhi, a man of such unwavering conviction that he would earn global acclaim, the second of the foreign statues in Parliament Square. Gandhi had cut his political teeth in South Africa, arriving here in 1893 as a 24-year-old London-trained lawyer to work for a client on a temporary assignment. What a twist of fate that would prove to be. For it would be the strange society being carved out in South Africa in the wake of their mineral revolution, which would inspire much of Gandhi's transformation and set him on course for greatness. For the discovery of diamonds and then gold had emerged as South Africa's equivalent of cotton in the Deep South, a commercial opportunity of such extraordinary magnitude, again limited only by a scarcity in cheap labor. Tragically, but perhaps predictably given Anthony Thomas's observation, South Africa would now follow the mistakes of the American South. And while slavery itself had long been banned, the controlling classes here began to build their own legally ring-fenced classes of labor. And in South Africa, these were being determined by race. And it would be this unjust race-based system which had inspired young Gandhi. All the alterations I have made in the course of my life, noted Gandhi, have been affected by momentous occasions, and they have been made after such deep deliberation that I have hardly had to regret them. One of these occasions was being thrown off a train in Pietermaritzburg for refusing to relinquish his first-class ticket on account of the color of his skin. Shivering through an icy winter's night on that Pietermaritzburg platform, Gandhi concentrated his anger, vowing from that moment to devote himself to fighting the deep disease of color prejudice. Gandhi now carried a profound political purpose, and so when his legal work was complete in 1894, Gandhi opted instead, and despite the farewell party organized, to remain in South Africa and to honor his shivering vow. However, the region was at the time spiraling towards the South African War, a conflict inspired by the curse of gold, discovered in the Boer Republic of the Transvaal, but which Britain desired to control. When war did break out, Gandhi contributed by establishing the Natal Indian Ambulance Corps. In January 1900, he was active at the deadly Battle of Spioenkop. I was privileged to visit that battlefield just 2 weeks before lockdown. It is a moving story, a tragic exercise in futility. Winston Churchill, who was also on top of that corps, observed, "Corpses lay here and there. The shallow trenches were choked with dead and wounded." And it was those Lancastrians who were again in the thick of it. The Lancashire Fusiliers, the Lancashire Regiment, and 2 companies of the South Lancashire Regiment. A heavy sacrifice now immortalized by Anfield's famous stand, the Corp. This battle, I would learn on top of that mountain, was to be another of Mohandas Gandhi's momentous occasions. In full view of the carnage of war, Gandhi asserted the importance of attaining his goals through peaceful means. The intensity of Gandhi's convictions saw him emerge as a natural leader, while his campaigns of civil disobedience were proving to be a formidable thorn in the side of Jan Smuts, who had assumed a leading role in rebuilding the region after the South African War. Smuts, the third of the foreign statues in Parliament Square, was a brilliant young lawyer who emerged from humble roots, an Afrikaner farm boy who earned himself a scholarship to Cambridge University. Lord Todd, the master of Christ College, said in 1970 that in 500 years of the college's history, of all its members past and present, 3 had been truly outstanding: John Milton, Charles Darwin, and Jan Smuts. But despite his flair for the law, Smuts would never be inspired by it. Instead, he shifted his focus to the more pragmatic art of politics, initially as a supporter of Cecil John Rhodes and the British Empire, but having been sold down the river by Rhodes's ill-conceived Jameson raid, Smuts switched his allegiance to Paul Kruger and the Transvaal, appointed in time as the Attorney General. Although Smuts would later give up his desk job and lead a commando on a successful counter-attack deep in British territory. But by then, the war was lost for the Boers, and Smuts, being a pragmatist, realized painfully that it was time to leverage his expertise and to work instead on the peace. Smuts emerged from the war with powerful credentials. These were further enhanced by his role in brokering the Union of South Africa in 1910. However, that process had required the age-old political lubricant of compromise. and as part of that compromise, race politics would tighten further and then spread across the greater region, notably through the Land Act of 1913, an act which had inspired the formation of the African National Congress, the ANC. Indeed, resistance to race politics was inevitably building, and the most high-profile thorn in the side of Jan Smuts came in the form of an Indian lawyer called Mohandas Gandhi, a young man building political momentum, leading his campaigns of passive resistance. Gandhi and Smuts would develop a complex relationship. Smuts was, of course, well aware of the moral compromise underpinning his union, and so he had both a great respect for Gandhi, but also a deep contempt, which saw Gandhi spending time behind bars. But true to form, Gandhi used that opportunity to make and then gift Smuts a pair of leather sandals. Smuts in turn would wear those sandals for many a summer, although noting later in life that he felt not worthy to stand in the shoes of so great a man. "The saint has left our shores," wrote Smuts when Gandhi did finally return to India in 1914. Smuts would later acknowledge that it had been his fate to be the antagonist of a man for whom, even then, I had the highest respect. Back in India, Gandhi's reputation earned in South Africa preceded him. By 1915, he was known as Mahatma, the Great Soul, and by 1920, a now 50-year-old Gandhi was the most visible profile in India's movement for independence from Britain. Gandhi's natural target was British economic interests in India, notably cotton. India's once powerful textile industry had been destroyed by a combination of the empire and the Industrial Revolution. Accordingly, on September 21st, 1921, in solidarity with the poor and in support of locally woven Indian cotton, Gandhi now dropped his until then meticulous Western outfits, and from that moment only ever wore a simple hand-woven cloth, a dhoti. This was another of Gandhi's momentous occasions, and the spinning wheel now emerged as a key symbol within the movement. With India making up Britain's largest export market, Gandhi initiated a boycott of British cotton products in 1929. The impact in Lancashire was again devastating. These were the grandchildren of the cotton famine generation. Gandhi visited Britain 2 years later in 1931 in order to discuss the future status of India. On asked whether he felt underdressed meeting King George at Buckingham Palace, he replied, "There was no problem. His Majesty more than made up for both of us." At the time, Gandhi's cotton boycott was now 2 years in. Carnage in the cotton mills. Nonetheless, Gandhi agreed to travel up to Lancashire, and one might have expected trouble from communities whose livelihoods had been so compromised, but in an extraordinary display, Gandhi was instead received as a hero, a champion of the working class. Gandhi had transcended politics. He was a global icon. Meanwhile, Smuts was active in the field during the Great War. His intellect and credentials would see his advice sought by world leaders, and he worked closely with Woodrow Wilson, developing a structure for the proposed League of Nations. Also, given his experiences on the losing side of the South African War, Smuts warned against a treaty which was overly punitive on the people of Germany. However, for all his respect on the international stage, Smuts found himself under political pressure back home. Notably, he had been labelled as a sellout to the British, a nation which many Afrikaner people still despised for their scorched earth policy and the concentration camps a generation before in the South African War. Indeed, the 1930s would see a sharp rise in Afrikaner nationalism, a force so pronounced that when Hitler dragged the world back into war in the late 1930s, Smuts's warnings at Versailles had not been heeded. Many of the Afrikaner people were disinclined to fight for their old enemy, Britain. Accordingly, Smuts, Prime Minister of the Union, now embarked on a roadshow right across the country trying to garner war support for the British and the Allied powers. One of these speeches was to the University of Fort Hare in the Eastern Cape. In the audience that day was a 21-year-old law student who had been most eager to hear Jan Smuts speak. His name was Nelson Mandela. Mandela had been an active student at Fort Hare. He played sport and joined the drama society where, interestingly, he played the part of a gun-wielding John Wilkes Booth in a play about Abraham Lincoln. But he was also becoming active in politics, which landed him in some trouble. And when he was also then faced with an arranged marriage, Mandela instead bolted for Johannesburg in 1940 to forge a new life. And it was in Johannesburg that Mandela would experience the stark reality of South Africa, and most notably the grim plight of his own proud African peoples. Mandela emerged as a student of Gandhi, and was prominent in the early years of the ANC Youth League established in 1944. This was to be an important development, for it was the Youth League which drove the ANC's transformation from an elite group of gentlemen instead into a powerful mass movement capable of meaningful passive resistance. Although for now, South Africa was focused on its war effort. Smuts' role as Prime Minister was strengthened by his lofty international status, further enhanced by his role in planning the United Nations. As such, Smuts was well placed going into the South African elections of 1948. That said, Smuts was by then 78 years old, a man still labelled by the Afrikaner National Party as a sellout, a man more interested in international politics than the plight of his own people. Further, divisions in Smuts' United Party meant that they were indecisive on the growing question of race politics. Even so, Smuts' reputation looked to have carried him in the elections, with his United Party winning 30% more votes than the National Party. However, in a cruel twist, the constituency system, which placed higher proportional value on rural votes, saw the National Party win the election under its proposed policy of apartheid. It had received less than 38% of the vote. Smuts, however, had finally been relieved of party politics. Meanwhile, India, led by Gandhi through a decades-long campaign, had finally won their independence a year before in 1947. Gandhi was then 77. Like Lincoln, he too would not have long to savour the victory, for Gandhi was assassinated in January of 1948. That said, Gandhi's spirit of resistance had taken on a life of its own, as Jan Smuts found himself being held accountable at the United Nations by India, who were highlighting the hypocrisy of a man fighting for human rights while in his own country these were being denied. Indeed, the National Party, notwithstanding its flimsy mandate, was acting swiftly and decisively. By the early 1950s, several of the key acts of apartheid had been passed. This had naturally galvanized the struggle movement, and the ANC, in which Mandela was increasingly active, embarked on a series of national campaigns of passive resistance, commencing with the famous Defiance Campaign of 1952. However, following Sharpeville and then Philip Gosana's march in early 1960, the ANC and the PAC were formally banned. But the struggle would continue, and Mandela, having exhausted every peaceful means of resistance, he eventually founded Umkhonto we Sizwe in 1961, which would target strategic state infrastructure. And it was sabotage which saw Mandela and his co-accused sentenced to life in prison in 1964. Again, the struggle would continue. Mandela eventually accepted his freedom in 1990, emerging as South Africa's natural leader as the nation transitioned towards democracy. His firm but clear message of reconciliation and hope would resonate around the world, the fourth international statue in Parliament Square. In 1996, Nelson Mandela was invited to London to address both British Houses of Parliament, one of only 3 foreign heads of state to do so from Westminster Hall since World War II, the 2 others being Charles de Gaulle and Barack Obama. It is an extraordinary chamber which dates back to the 11th century and which has played witness to coronation banquets and high-profile trials, notably William Wallace and Guy Fawkes. And as we gazed out into that massive hall, our host now pointed towards our shoes, where there was a small plaque marking the spot from where Nelson Mandela had made his address. It was at this very moment that our host's phone buzzed, and he set off to collect another guest who was joining us for lunch. So, here stood my wife and I. It made for a wonderful moment to contemplate. One's national pride is always heightened when away from home. But it is quite extraordinary that the story of a seemingly insignificant land at the southern tip of Africa should be so well represented in statues and plaques right here in Westminster. There is no clear answer as to why, but to say that the tribulations that our nation has undergone created a framework which has played host to some of the very worst and the very best humanity has to offer. And while often painful, South Africa's story offers passion in great abundance, and with that, the opportunity for a meaningful life.